Hey guys, I'm here to talk to you about my June reads. I cannot believe June is already over. I feel like June was the fastest month of the year so far, but that could be because I was traveling at the beginning of the month. I also feel like my reads at the beginning of the month were more on the lackluster side, and I was thinking about how a lot of the books I read this year, I do feel that way about. I talked about this in one of my previous vlogs, that one of my reading resolutions for this year was to read more recent releases, but I think I'm going to stray from that resolution now. I don't even know why I decided that across the board, because I already do read contemporary fiction, literary fiction, recent releases. It was just never the majority of the books I would read. I'll continue to read those, but also make room for what I know I love to read, which are usually classic literature, especially lesser known ones. And I'm not saying one is superior to the other, it's really just preference. And to be honest, my issue is I just want to read everything. Anyways, the first book I finished reading in June was My Phantoms by Gwendoline Riley. Riley is a British writer and she has a good amount of books published. There is one other one published by NYRB. I think it's First Love. That one also has an amazing cover as well as this one. I do think this is one of her more recent releases, or second to most recent. This came out in 2021. And then here is First Love. Yeah, First Love is 2017. I love the traditional NYRB Classics covers, but these are also great as well. So the main character in My Phantoms is Bridget. She's the narrator, but I think it would be more apt to say that the main character is actually her mother, Helen. From her descriptions, it seems that Helen suffers from some kind of neurosis, maybe. Even though she's very social, she has trouble making lasting friendships and relationships because it seems that she doesn't know how to genuinely connect with others. She reads people wrong and just inappropriately, and this also applies to her daughter. She also seems to be a passive-aggressive type, very self-absorbed, miserable with herself and her life, but unwilling to do anything actionable about it. So in the beginning of the story, we actually hear a good amount about Bridget's father. He is divorced from Helen, and to be honest, he's not any better. To put it plainly, he's described as a deluded megalomaniac. And because from the beginning we hear so much about him and Helen, I thought that the story would center around Bridget and her dynamic with both of her parents. But after his description ends, the story zeroes in on just Bridget and her mother. And to be honest, Bridget herself isn't really likable either. Yes? Even though she's the narrator, I still felt like I didn't know her. She comes across as distant, aloof, maybe even guarded, and I felt that that impression was actually a disservice to her narration. Helen and Bridget's relationship is definitely odd, but I think it's mostly because nothing is ever broached, and the reader is also pretty much left in the dark a lot of the times. And by the end of the story, even though I did not dislike this book, I found it very readable, easy to get through. I was left with a feeling of, I don't know these people and I don't care about them that much. They still felt like strangers to me even though I spent time with them. I do think actually First Love is more popular than My Phantoms, so I actually do wish I had started with First Love. I was just drawn way more to this cover, if I'm honest, and the title, My Phantoms. However, my experience reading this book was not negative, and my opinion has not deterred me from picking up more by her. Let me know if you guys have read this book or anything else by Gwendoline Riley. I want to hear your thoughts. Okay, the next book I ended up finishing was The Long Island Compromise by Taffy Brodesser-Akner. This was for my book club with Emily, and this time it was her turn to pick. So Taffy Brodesser-Akner is an American writer. Her one other book is, I think it's pronounced Fleischman. Fleischman is in Trouble. I don't know anything about that book, but I do recognize the title and I can envision the cover, so I do think it's well known and popular. Immediately, I'm gonna say it, I did not like this book, and this is not typically the type of book I would choose to read. Same with my friend Emily. To be honest, that aspect does not bother me at all. I love to explore new reads, different types of books I wouldn't normally pick up. I just simply did not like the story and the characters in the story. So it's about the Fletcher family. They are a very well-off family. I believe they own a polystyrene company or factory on Long Island. The father of the family, Carl, he ends up getting kidnapped and held for ransom. At the time of the kidnapping, his two sons are very young and they're not privy to what is going on. They were protected from it. And the daughter, the youngest sibling, she's not yet born yet. His wife was pregnant with her at the time. Then the majority of the story is told from when the Fletcher children are all grown up. We get to hear from each of them individually and can clearly see how the trauma of the parents, especially the father, has deeply affected each of the children, showcasing how trauma can be passed down through generations. Here's my contention. A large majority of this book was spent with two of the sons who I could not stand, especially one in particular. I remember I kept flipping forward to see when his part would end. It felt unbearable to hear from him. He just came across as really gross and whiny. The second son, who we hear from next, he was a bit more bearable, and then the daughter even more so, but none of them I really connected to or liked that much. I did not actually start enjoying this book until I heard from the father himself. And actually, we don't really get to hear from him at all until we reach about like this section in the book. At that point is when I started feeling something for this family. Prior to that, everything was unbearable. I just wanted the book to end, and if I hadn't been sharing this burden with my friend, I might have DNF'd it. Because Emily and I were reading it together and basically being haters, it was more fun. Another thing is every character in this book feels very much like a caricature, and I do think that's done on purpose. The story and the characters were exaggerated, humorous. I acknowledge that. It's just not my type of humor. I found most of it to be annoyingly crass. However, I will say that I did enjoy the way the story wrapped up. I thought that was funny. I thought that was a good one. And I also wasn't expecting it, so she definitely got me there. Anyways, if you guys have read this or her other book, let me know your thoughts. I then went on to read Blessings by the Nigerian author Chukwuebuka Ibeh. This is a gay coming-of-age story about Obifuna growing up in Nigeria. From a young age, he has felt different from other boys his age, from his father, from his younger brother, something that hasn't been lost on his family members, especially his mother. His father ends up bringing home another young boy, I think from another village, and that boy is there to help the father and the mother around the house, like doing chores, tasks, and from context, this seems like a normal setup. Obifuna ends up having a crush on this fellow. They end up sharing this little romantic moment together, which his father witnesses, and in anger, he ends up sending Obifuna to an all-boys boarding school and alienating him from the rest of his family. At the school, Obifuna has a hard time fitting in with the other boys. Well, he does, but he kind of has to put on this masquerade of himself in order not to be ostracized and bullied, and also expelled from the school. Even so though, he still has the opportunity to explore himself, find out what he likes, who he likes, but instead of that being an enlightening, positive experience, it only fills him with a sense of doom, dread, unhappiness, which is unfortunately a sad reality for many youth. They've been unable to have a positive coming-of-age experience. Instead, they've been made to feel shame or even fear in an experience that should only give empowerment and confidence. It's only until he reaches college that he's more able to accept himself. The story also teeters between his voice and his mother's voice, which I really enjoyed. Even though they were physically separated, their narrations I think worked really well together, and I found it touching. I will say I was not wowed by this book. I found it enjoyable, readable, but I still just felt that it was okay. I think it started on a very strong note, but as the story went on, especially after a certain time skip, it started to fall flat for me. I also felt that the wrap up in the end was a bit rushed. And even though the story does culminate in tragic things happening, I didn't get that sense from the narrator. Obifuna's voice, which was strong, unique, captivating from the beginning, was gone. However, this is a debut novel, and I do think it's a strong one, so I would be curious to pick up whatever he writes next. My next read is definitely my favorite of the month, and that was Sisters by a River by Barbara Comyns. Comyns was a British writer publishing in the mid-1900s. If you don't know, I'm a big fan of hers. The Vet's Daughter is one of my favorite books. I adore all of her stories I've read. I adore her writing style. Nothing I've read by her has disappointed me yet, and she's one of the writers whose work I plan to read all of. I've actually now tracked down all of her published books except one, and this has not been an easy nor cheap feat. I would say half of her books, if not most, are now out of print. Honestly, I find that to be a huge shame, but who knows? I have been yammering about her for a while now, and even though I don't think I have a lot of influence in this, maybe me recommending her books will get other people curious about her books, so then more people will feel inspired to search them out, which could then inspire some publishers to acquire them and reprint. I'm not sure how it works, or maybe the publishers who do own her stories would be motivated to reprint them. Last year, a biography of hers was published, which is a good omen. So Sisters by a River is her first published novel, but I don't think it's the first one that she wrote. It's supposed to be semi-autobiographical about 5 sisters growing up next to a river. The narrator is one of the middle sisters, and I cannot emphasize enough how much I loved her narrative voice. She was lovely, honest, funny, offbeat, strange, and mean. Such a unique personality, but still very relatable and believable of a young girl. And rather than this being a linear, traditional plot or story, it's more like snapshots or vignettes. Every chapter is quite short and it will be a little story or observation, which usually I don't like that type of writing, but I thought it worked wonderfully here. In fact, I loved it. It's definitely not an idyllic story about 5 sisters growing up next to a river. In fact, it's a bit tragic and even disturbing, but here's something I'm obsessed with. There is this strong overtone of what I can only describe as a muffled he while this story is being told with a completely straight face. This is, in my opinion, a perfect illustration of deadpan humor. Not only that, there is an undertone of something being awry, uncanny, maybe even a little bit eerie. And this mood of he and unsettling is quite common in most of her stories I've read. I think it's because she writes in this childlike, innocent manner. That's how her narrators, her main characters, are usually telling their stories. No matter their age, they have this childlike, simplistic view of life. However, her stories do not feel childlike or simple. Her writing, her stories are still very sharp, insightful, and clever. I could go on and on. I think Barbara Comyns is a wonder. She rivals Shirley Jackson, who I adore. Actually, I don't like to think of them as rivals. Barbara Comyns is almost Shirley Jackson's British counterpart, but I do also think that they're very distinct from one another in amazing ways. What I'll end with, if I've piqued your interest on Barbara Comyns and you haven't read her work yet, I recommend starting with The Vet's Daughter, which is published by NYRB, so you can easily find a copy. That one is her most well-known, and if you end up reading anything by her, I think it should be that one. However, I did love this one and everything else I've read by her. Okay, the last book I ended up finishing in June was A Game of Hide and Seek by Elizabeth Taylor, another writer who I adore. Angel by her is one of my favorite books, and I also really enjoyed Mrs. Palfrey at the Claremont. Taylor is another English writer who was actually publishing at the same time as Comyns, like mid-1900s. And also, like Comyns, a lot of her books are out of print and difficult to find. I do have quite a few from Virago, the green covers here, that I've tracked down and plan to read. So at least a week has passed from me finishing this book. I can now say that this is not one of my favorites by her, although I still really enjoyed it. The main character is Harriet. She is a shy, awkward, self-conscious girl, and the entire plot centers around her feelings for her childhood friend, Vesey. Vesey, when she was 18, she had a big crush on him. I'm unsure if at the time Vesey returned that crush though. He was for sure interested, but also one of those annoyingly aloof, non-committal guys who are also, to be honest, kind of rude to everyone. As they get older, they lose touch and they both move on with their lives. Vesey is off doing his own thing, Harriet does her thing. Eventually they end up reconnecting. I think they're in their late 30s, early 40s, and Harriet still has strong feelings for him, which I think he reciprocates. To be honest, I didn't really understand why, especially Harriet. Why did she like him so much or love him so much? Maybe because he was a childhood crush. It's one of those things. And I'm obviously not going to tell you what happens. Despite me not being able to understand Harriet or relate to her, I still enjoyed this. It has Taylor's typical narrative style, which is very insightful, but also subtle and quiet. And even though I could not understand Harriet at times, Taylor still manages to write the most relatable characters and life conundrums. You will see yourself in her characters and feel slightly shamed, but also comforted. Her prose is spot on, and just like Comyns, she's sharp, clever, insightful, but in her own unique way, which I fully appreciate and celebrate. If you're new to Elizabeth Taylor and you would like a recommendation about where to start, I would start with Mrs. Palfrey at the Claremont. But like I said, from what I've read so far, Angel is definitely my favorite, one of my all-time favorite books. And those are all the books I read in June. I didn't read as much as I had hoped to last month, but I still think it was a wonderful reading month for me. I also cannot believe we're halfway through the year. I feel like I just started making these videos on YouTube yesterday. If you've been watching and following along with my little book thoughts since December or January, thank you so much. I've been an avid reader my whole life, and I've only had very few people I could discuss my reads with, so I feel so blessed to have this community. I feel like I can geek out about what I love and find like-minded people. I'm looking forward to discovering many more amazing books in 2025 and the rest of my life while I can. Please let me know what you read in June, what you loved reading in June, and also in the first half of the year as well. I'm very nosy. I always like to know people's favorite books, and I will see you guys soon.